The battlefield outside Mejaz El Bab was silent by the time the dust settled. The smell of burnt rubber and cordite hung thick in the Tunisian heat, a kind of metallic sweetness that clung to the back of the throat. The sun had already baked the ground hard enough to crack, and through the haze of smoke and flies, something vast and still stood half-buried in the dirt. It was a tank, blackened, scarred, but not broken. Its turret was frozen mid-turn, the long barrel pointing toward a ridge that no longer mattered. Around it, the earth was littered with the wreckage of Shermans and Grants, their armor peeled like fruit skin, their tracks twisted into ribbons. The thing at the center of it all looked untouched. Captain Bill Rogers of the U.S. 2nd Armored Division climbed over the hull, his boots slipping on soot. He placed his hand on the cold steel and felt its weight, the way it seemed to hum even after silence had claimed the valley. "So that's the Tiger," he said, almost to himself. No one spoke. The Americans had heard rumors for months, stories passed from British units, whispers of a new German monster capable of tearing through Allied armor from over a mile away. But rumors never prepared them for this. The machine was enormous, taller than any tank they had ever seen, its armor pitted with dents that hadn't even come close to penetrating. Rogers traced one of the gouges with his fingers. The mark was deep, like a scar from something that had barely scratched the surface. Nearby, a young lieutenant crouched beside a Sherman that had been reduced to ash. 3 hits, he said quietly. All direct. None of them even slowed it down. Rogers didn't answer. He climbed onto the Tiger's turret, peered into the barrel. The inside was clean, polished, almost elegant. There was a faint smell of oil and burnt powder, but nothing else. This was no wreck. It was a survivor that had simply run out of war. A British officer approached, his khaki uniform streaked with dust. "We thought it was another Panzer," he said, shaking his head. "It took 5 tanks and an airstrike to stop it. Only hit it from the rear, and even then," he gestured at the ruined landscape. "Even then, it nearly kept going. They circled it like men studying a fallen animal, a creature so dangerous that even dead, it commanded respect. The armor was over 4 inches thick, sloped like a fortress wall. The treads were wide and layered, designed to grip mud and stone with equal cruelty. Everything about it seemed impossible. By late afternoon, engineers had arrived with cranes and trucks. They photographed everything: the tracks, the turret, the gun sights, the engine vents. A mechanic whistled under his breath. "This thing's got more precision in one bolt than a Sherman has in its whole transmission." Another engineer leaned close to the hull and knocked on it twice. The sound was dull, solid, final. "They didn't build this to move fast," he said. "They built it to outlive God." When they finally pried open the hatch, the interior glowed faintly in the fading sunlight. Inside, everything was clean, organized, built with an almost surgical neatness. The controls were labeled in neat Gothic script, the wiring bundled and tied. Even in ruin, it looked proud. A dead crew lay slumped over their posts, burned, but still wearing gloves. Someone had tried to cover one of them with a jacket before escaping the flames. The gesture was oddly human inside this machine's inhuman perfection. A radio technician climbed inside and sat in the commander's seat, running his fingers over the dials. "Carl Zeiss Optics," he murmured. "Perfect alignment. No wonder they could hit us before we saw them." Outside, the officers conferred over maps. "Get it on a ship," Rogers said finally. "Send it to England. Tell them not to lose a single bolt." By nightfall, the Tiger was being loaded onto a flatbed truck, the winches straining against its weight. Soldiers gathered to watch as the black giant was pulled from the battlefield, its broken treads dragging a trail of sparks. To the men who had fought it, it looked less like a vehicle and more like something unearthed, an artifact from a civilization that had mastered both beauty and terror. As the convoy rolled toward the coast, the last light caught the tank's number stenciled on its turret, 131. One of the mechanics wrote it down in his logbook, though he didn't know why. Maybe he wanted proof it had really existed. On the deck of a transport ship 2 days later, the Tiger stood chained and silent under the open sky. Sailors avoided walking too close to it. Even stationary, it carried a strange gravity, as if it might wake at any moment. One of the men swore he saw the turret shift in the moonlight, though no one believed him. Below deck, Rogers wrote his report. Captured intact. Severe resistance. Armor impervious to current Allied weapons. Recommend full technical evaluation. He hesitated before the last line, then added, if they have hundreds of these, God help us. He folded the paper, signed it, and set it aside. Outside, the sea hissed softly against the hull. The ship's engines throbbed beneath his feet, carrying the tank and its questions toward England. It would be months before anyone understood what they had truly found. For now, the Tiger stood unmoving, its gun pointed toward a horizon that would never answer. It had not fired a single shot since capture, and yet, it had already forced the Allies to redefine what war meant. Where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe to this channel. The Tiger arrived in England under rain. It came ashore at night, chained to a flat car, the steam from the docks wrapping around it like breath. Soldiers and dockworkers gathered at a distance, staring as if the thing might roll forward on its own. Floodlights cut across its armor, and for the first time, the British could see what the Americans had been whispering about. Even standing still, it looked alive. By dawn, it was on the road to Farnborough, the top-secret mechanical testing ground where captured weapons were taken apart, measured, understood. Guards rode alongside the truck in jeeps, as though escorting a prisoner. The driver joked that if the tank slipped off the ramp, it would take the whole convoy with it. No one laughed. At the facility, engineers and ordnance officers waited under gray skies, clipboards in hand. They had examined German planes, bombs, and guns before, but never anything like this. The tank's sheer size seemed to distort the space around it. Its armor caught the light like wet stone. The moment it stopped moving, the sound of rain against its hull was the only thing anyone could hear. When they opened the hatches, the air that came out was stale but clean, still carrying the faint scent of machine oil. The interior looked untouched, almost reverent. Gauges shone like new coins. Levers moved smoothly, no grinding, no rust. A British technician, his overalls smeared with grease, leaned in and muttered, "This isn't a tank. It's a bloody clockwork cathedral." The team began cataloging everything. They removed panels one by one, photographing each detail before unbolting it. Every screw head was marked with paint, every plate numbered. The welds were perfect, thin, even, as if carved rather than laid by hand. When they lifted the turret, it took 3 cranes and an entire morning. Underneath, the seams were so tight that the engineers could hardly fit a knife blade between them. Inside the workshop, the Tiger stood stripped to its bones. Someone chalked its number, 131, across the floor beside the parts. It looked less like a tank now and more like an autopsy. A young officer from the Ministry of Supply kept a journal of the disassembly. His first entry read, "They built this as if it were meant to last 1,000 years. Every part feels deliberate." His second, "We don't build tanks. We build tractors that happen to carry guns." When they tested the armor, sparks flew across the concrete walls. A 3-inch round at close range barely left a dent. 100 millimeters, the chief engineer said quietly, running his hand along the impact mark. Sloped, layered. "We'd need twice the powder to even make a scratch." Behind him, another man whistled under his breath and muttered, "They could drive through hell and not even chip the paint." Then came the optics, Carl Zeiss glass, ground so fine that when the British tried to recreate the clarity, they failed. The sighting system allowed a gunner to lock onto a target at incredible range with near-perfect precision. "You don't aim this thing," said one of the gunners assisting the test. "You just point, and the shell knows where to go." Everywhere they looked, there was evidence of obsession. The internal wiring was bundled with silk thread, labeled and routed with geometric care. Even the smallest gear inside the turret drive had a maker's mark stamped on it. The Germans had built the Tiger the way a jeweler builds a watch, with pride, patience, and the certainty that no one else could match them. By the end of the second week, the British had filled 3 notebooks just describing the suspension system. Each wheel was interlocked with another, 24 in total, overlapping to spread the tank's enormous weight. The design was genius, until they realized what it meant in the field. Changing a single wheel required removing half the others. "If one goes," a mechanic muttered, "the whole bloody side comes off." Still, the admiration was undeniable. "This machine," one report read, "was not assembled. It was sculpted." Another added, "You could park it in front of a firing squad." and it would simply wait for them to run out of ammunition. The engineers worked through the nights, their floodlights glowing across the wet tarmac. Sometimes, between tests, they would just stand and look at it. The Tiger seemed to hold a kind of gravity, a reminder that somewhere across the channel, men were still building more of them. Then, during one of the final inspections, a mechanic ran his hand along the transmission casing and frowned. The part was elegant, yes, but far too delicate for what it was meant to do. "Look here," he said, tapping the housing. "It's brilliant design, but over-engineered. You get mud in this, or heat for too long, it'll seize up." He wiped his hand on a rag, leaving a smear of grease over the German serial numbers. "They've built something too perfect," he said quietly. "Too proud." The chief engineer nodded, closing his notebook. "And perfection," he murmured, "doesn't forgive the battlefield." That line stayed with everyone in the room. For the first time, they began to suspect that inside this monument to precision might be the one flaw that could save them. Outside, the rain kept falling, steady, relentless, washing the dust from the Tiger's black armor until it gleamed again. It looked unbreakable, but inside the steel, something fragile was waiting to be found. They had expected genius. What they found instead was tragedy disguised as excellence. By the third week at Farnborough, the Tiger no longer looked invincible. Its pieces lay across the hangar floor, hulking plates of armor, cables, gears, and fragments of tread stacked like the organs of something too complex to live. The longer the engineers studied it, the clearer it became. This was brilliance turned inward, a machine that had outsmarted itself. The transmission was the first betrayal. Under ideal conditions, it was smooth as silk, German precision at its purest. But after an hour of testing, it began to whine. 2 hours later, it seized entirely. When they drained the oil, it came out black with metal dust. The chief mechanic stared at the sludge in the tray and muttered, "Too fine. Every gear depends on every other. One speck of dirt, and the whole thing dies." The same story repeated across the tank. The cooling system overheated. The suspension sagged under its own weight. Even the intricate wheel assemblies, the ones that had inspired such admiration, clogged with mud during field trials. To repair a single section meant dismantling half the machine. "They built a masterpiece," one British officer said. But the battlefield doesn't care for masterpieces. When the tests ended, the engineers gathered for a final report. They listed the numbers in neat columns. Weight, 57 tons. Armor, 100 millimeters. Range, barely 60 miles on full fuel. Maintenance hours, uncountable. Someone laughed dryly. "You could run 8 Shermans for what it takes to keep this monster breathing." The laughter died quickly. The Americans who had come to observe took notes, comparing figures with their own M4 Shermans. The difference was philosophical as much as mechanical. The Sherman was crude, fast, easy to repair. A crew could replace its engine in a field ditch and have it running before sundown. The Tiger demanded workshops, spare parts, engineers, a civilization of support for a single tank. "Beautiful," said one U.S. officer, running a hand along the polished gun barrel, "but too proud to get dirty." Still, no one could deny its terror. In combat, even a single Tiger could paralyze entire regiments. Crews reported that just hearing its engine was enough to freeze men where they stood. Its 88mm gun could punch through Allied armor from ranges their own weapons could barely dream of. When a Tiger appeared on the horizon, soldiers whispered about it the way villagers once whispered about storms. To the engineers, though, the myth was cracking. They saw the cost written in numbers and fatigue. The Tiger wasn't a weapon built for war, it was built for worship. Germany's obsession with perfection had created something magnificent, but magnificence doesn't win campaigns. Logistics do. One British analyst wrote in his report, "They've built a killing machine that kills itself. For every Tiger that rolls off their line, we roll out 8 Shermans. We'll bury them in steel." During one of the last demonstrations, they ran the Tiger's Maybach engine under controlled heat. The sound began low and confident, the deep growl of power. But after 20 minutes, the pitch climbed into a shriek. Steam hissed from the vents. The operator shut it down, sweat running into his eyes. The engine clicked as it cooled, each tick like a heartbeat slowing to silence. "They made it for parades," he said quietly. "Not for mud." The hangar emptied at dusk. The stripped tiger sat alone beneath the lights, a shadow of its old arrogance. The men who had studied it left with mixed emotions. Awe, pity, a strange respect. One of them paused at the door, looking back at the machine. "It's a monument," he said, "to an idea that can't survive its own beauty." Outside, the rain had stopped. The night was still, heavy with mist. Somewhere in the distance, the rumble of Allied bombers carried over the channel, a reminder of another kind of perfection, mass, speed, and inevitability. Even broken, the tiger's silhouette seemed to hum with menace. And they all knew, somewhere on the front, others like it were still moving, still fighting, still feared. Because for all its flaws, when a tiger appeared on the battlefield, the ground itself seemed to tremble. And that sound, that deep, iron heartbeat, meant one thing to every soldier who heard it. The monster still breathed. He moved slowly, but when he fired, even the ground seemed to flinch. The tiger didn't need speed, it needed presence. Snow fell lightly across the fields near Cherkasy, dusting the black tracks of its passage. Each cleat pressed deep into the frozen mud, like the footprint of something prehistoric. The engine growled low, almost calm, and the sound carried miles through the cold air. Allied tank crews learned to recognize it instantly. They'd stop talking, stop breathing, and wait for the next sound, the single, thunderous report of the 88mm gun. "You hear them before you see them," one American officer wrote. "And by the time you see them, it's already too late." In those months, the winter of 1943 into early 1944, the Tiger was not a weapon so much as a rumor made real. Every Allied advance felt like walking toward an unseen giant. The men could smell it, the mix of exhaust, cordite, and frozen oil. The air shook before the shell arrived. One flash, one breath, and then a Sherman would vanish in a cloud of orange fire. At Villers-Bocage, the Tiger's legend gained a name. June 13, 1944, the streets still wet from morning rain. Michael Whitman, commander of Tiger 007, led his tank into a narrow lane lined with British vehicles. His gunner whispered the distances, 300, 200, and Whitman gave the order to fire. One shot, and the lead Cromwell exploded. A second, and the next tank in line went up like kindling. By the time smoke covered the town square, 12 armored vehicles had been destroyed. The radio log from that day reads like a list of disappearances. A British survivor described it simply: "We hit him 6 times. He didn't burn. He just turned the gun." That phrase spread faster than any official report. To Allied crews, Whitman became a ghost, and the Tiger, a nightmare that hunted in daylight. It didn't matter that there were only a few hundred of them. On the battlefield, each one felt immortal. In the Ardennes, the snow muffled everything except the echo of its engine. A Sherman crew sat in ambush, breath clouding the inside of their periscope. The driver whispered, "We're meat in a can." The gunner didn't answer. They waited, hearts pounding against steel, until the low growl began again. Closer, slower, confident. When the Tiger fired, the shockwave made the turret rings sing. The shell passed, so near it felt like wind. The commander radioed one word: smoke. Before they reversed down the hill, blind and coughing, praying the next round missed. Reports from the front became increasingly clinical, as if logic could contain fear. Tiger element sighted. Engaged at 1,200 yards. Allied shells ineffective. But buried in the margins were the human notes. Sound alone disrupts unit cohesion. Men panic when silhouettes are seen. It feels alive. In a French village near Cannes, civilians watched as a Tiger rolled through the main street, its treads grinding cobblestones into powder. A woman sweeping her doorstep didn't move. She just lowered her head and pressed her palm to the wall as it passed, feeling the vibration crawl through the bricks. Even German crews described the machine with unease. One captured gunner, no older than 20, said through cracked lips, "When we fire, I stop being myself. The tank becomes the person." He said it without pride, only exhaustion. The Tiger's power was more than mechanical, it was psychological. Allied soldiers claimed they could tell its approach by the way birds stopped singing. Some swore they could feel it before hearing it. Others said the ground itself warned them. A corporal wrote in his diary, "The sky goes heavy before it appears," as if even the air knows what's coming. But fear can't hold the front forever. For every tiger that prowled the fields, a dozen Shermans waited with new orders to move fast, to flank, to swarm. Engineers back in England were already testing new shells, longer guns, sharper angles. The first time one of those modified rounds punched through a captured tiger's frontal armor at close range, the range officers didn't cheer. They just stared. One of them whispered, "Finally, a chance." On the line, though, the fear remained. An American tanker near Mortine wiped frost from his scope and caught a glimpse of motion, not fast, but deliberate. "He's out there," he said quietly to his driver. "He always is." They waited in silence, the engine ticking beneath them. The tiger never appeared. But the thought of it, that sound, that breath, that invisible weight, stayed in their minds long after. The monster had become more than steel. It was an idea, one that lived in the space between heartbeat and hesitation. And yet, as it hunted, far behind the lines men in white coats and goggles were studying how to kill it. While soldiers whispered its name at the front, engineers were already designing its extinction. They answered the monster with arithmetic. Not poetry, not pride, numbers. In meeting rooms that smelled of coffee and graphite, officers passed around the Farnborough notes, while engineers traced new lines over old blueprints. The conclusion was blunt. If one tiger bent the battlefield, then the battlefield had to bend back. Not by building a better idol, but by swarming it with workmanlike machines that could fight today and be fixed tonight. At the proving ground in Aberdeen, a captured tiger plate stood like a tombstone under white lights. A chalk X marked the spot the gunners kept missing by a thumb's width. Tools rang against concrete. A lathe sang somewhere behind the sandbags. The first round of the morning, a standard 75mm AP, smacked the steel, spat sparks, and left a shallow crater that felt like an insult. The range officer said nothing, only wrote the depth in a notebook greased dark at the edges. Again, in the adjoining shed, men with burn-scarred fingers fitted longer barrels to Sherman turrets. The 76mm M1A1 looked plain until the first test shot. A flatter arc, a sharper punch, the sound more whip than thud. Metallurgists in lab coats worked over crucibles, balancing hardness against brittleness. They cast a new core, tungsten, dense as gilt, and slid it into a dart of a projectile. HVAP, they called it, high-velocity armor piercing, a bullet that tried to erase the distance between fear and contact. Back on the line, doctrine shifted with the weather. Platoons practiced the swarm. 2 Shermans would hold a tiger's eye while a third ran the long curve into its flank. Not heroic, just patient geometry. Smoke became a tool rather than a prayer. Radios learned new verbs: fix, peel, bite. A captain on a muddy field in Wiltshire told his men, "We don't duel it. We corner it. Think wolves, not knights." They laughed at the image, then stopped laughing when the exercise worked twice in a row. Factories answered the theory with motion. Michigan nights glowed orange as furnaces fed lines that didn't sleep. Women in bandanas torqued bolts to the beat of a foreman's hand. Teenagers inked inspection stamps as solemnly as signatures. A clerk posted a comparison on a bulletin board where men took lunch standing up. The price of one tiger equaled 8 Shermans, plus spares. Underneath, someone penciled, 8 today. Another hand added, 8 tomorrow. There was arrogance in Berlin, yes, but in Detroit there was stubbornness, not the shout, the shrug. An engineer writing home to his brother put it plainer. They make jewels. We make hammers. You knock with one long enough, castles open. The letter came back oil-smudged. He kept it in his pocket anyway. In a windowless room at Ordnance, a colonel ran a fingertip along the traced outline of a tiger's frontal arc. "We can't always go around," he said. "Sometimes we have to go through." He looked up. So either the shell changes or the angle does. The next week, a field memo reached battalion level. Aim lower glassy, aim mantlet edge, make it turn. The memo was dry, but the effect was human, the kind of knowledge that steadies hands. The day the new round finally bit, the proving ground held its breath. The plate stood at a slight cant. The air was cold enough to make the barrel smoke in small, polite puffs. Load HVAP. The gun barked. The impact rang tinny, wrong, and then right. A dark flower opened on the far side. Petals of spalled steel curled like a dead thing's hand. No one cheered. The range officer raised the notebook and said, almost gently, penetration. A sergeant took one step back, sat on an ammo crate, and laughed once. Not loud, just relieved. For the first time, he said, a chance. On the Norman roads, the effect was immediate but not cinematic. A Sherman troop worked a hedgerow like a zipper. One tank took the glance, two swung wide. The German gun's bark still slammed the ribs, but the counterpunch got there more often. A tiger that once sat arrogant in the lane now had to consider the left and the right, and the smoke that made its sight glass lie. Men who had called themselves meat began to call themselves crews again. Not every plan survived mud. HVAP came in crates too light and too few. Tungsten was rationed like mercy. Sometimes the long gun jammed when the barrel heated. Sometimes a tiger didn't read the script and simply moved where the ambush wasn't. But the curve had bent. The monster didn't own the morning anymore. Back in the States, the assembly lines kept teaching the same lesson every hour. Speed is a weapon. Tanks rolled off carousels with cereals still wet, onto trains that left while the whistle's echo was young. A foreman pointed at a wall chart that measured production in inches of paper and said, "That's our armor." He wasn't wrong. In a dusty motor pool outside St. Lo, a lieutenant briefed a new batch of replacements beside a Sherman with fresh weld scars. He traced the silhouette of a tiger on a ration box, marked the turret ring, the drive sprocket, the seam under the mantlet. "We don't fear it," he said, and his voice betrayed him. "We plan for it." He tapped the box with the butt of a grease pencil. 3 on 1. Smoke on call. If you miss, you move. If he turns, you win. That evening, rain flattened the fields and the hedges steamed. In a barn lit by a single bulb, a crew laid HVAP rounds on a blanket like a priest setting vessels. The loader picked one up and weighed it, surprised by the lie of its lightness. The gunner ran a rag through the long barrel and, without looking up, said, "If he shows his face, we can hurt him now." No one said kill. Hurt was enough to change behavior. Hurt was the beginning of retreat. In laboratories and depots and muddy lanes, America's answer had taken shape. Not an idol on tracks, but a system, doctrine, logistics, industry, all aimed at one problem until the problem blinked. The tiger still frightened men. It would always frighten men. But fear had been given a schedule, a counterweight, a plan. Night fell. Somewhere beyond the hedgerow, an engine rolled over and settled into a patient purr. The Sherman crew listened, each counting the seconds in his own head, the old dread rising, and meeting something new. The commander closed his hatch and spoke so softly the intercom had to lean in to hear him. "Load HVAP." The breech clacked. The gun settled. The field waited. The monster still stood in the dark. But now, for the first time, it had an edge it couldn't keep. Spring 1945 came gray and thin, melting the last snow into mud that swallowed boots and engines alike. Germany was breaking apart. Convoys without fuel, soldiers without orders, villages without names. And among the ruins, the monsters began to die. The first one they found sat in a ditch near Kassel, its turret frozen at an awkward angle, paint burned to the metal. The white cross on its side looked like bones under charred skin. AUS. Sergeant climbed onto the hull, expecting an ambush. Instead, only silence. Inside, ash, twisted belts, and the smell of burned oil. "Empty," he said. "Just gave up." More appeared as the armies advanced. Tigers scattered like the bones of an extinct species. Some half-buried in thawing fields. Others abandoned neatly beside the road, hatches open as if waiting for judgment. A few had holes punched through their sides, but most had died untouched. No fuel, no spare parts, no crew. The greatest tank in the world had simply stopped moving. One American mechanic tapped on an empty fuel tank with his wrench and grinned. 2 years we feared this thing, he said. Turns out all it needed was gas. The veterans who had once coaxed these machines across the Eastern Front were gone. Their replacements were boys, shaking, exhausted, untrained. One captured driver, barely 18, showed his English interrogator the manual he'd been given. "They said shift slow," he muttered. "I never learned night driving." Everywhere, the same story, perfection without support. Workshops bombed, rail lines severed, depots empty. A tank that required 50 hours of maintenance for every hour of movement now had none. Mechanics stripped one Tiger for parts to save another, only to abandon both. Mud seized the delicate wheels, transmission snapped, the Maybach engines coughed once, twice, and died. The numbers told the truth no propaganda could hide. Out of 1,350 Tiger I tanks ever built, almost all were lost. Many were destroyed by their own complexity, not by Allied shells. They built too much machine for too little war, wrote one British analyst. In a burned village near Potterbourne, an American patrol stopped beside a Tiger that had melted into its own armor. The gun barrel drooped like wax, the tracks warped from heat. A soldier sat on the glacis, running his hand over the scorched metal. "You were something," he said softly, "but you couldn't last." Later, an engineer arrived with a clipboard. He walked around the wreck, still admiring it even in ruin. The precision of the welds, the geometry of the turret ring, the sheer arrogance of its design. His report was short. Perfection unsuited to reality. It read like an obituary. By April, the roads were lined with them. Tigers with white flags tied to antennas, chalked words scrawled across their armor. No fuel. Crew gone. American convoys drove past them without slowing. The old fear had vanished. You could touch one now, run your hand along the cold steel that once ruled battlefields. It felt strange, like touching a dead god. A.U.S. Cameraman filmed one lying half-submerged in a riverbank. The lens caught the open hatch, the water lapping at its edges, the way sunlight glinted off a rusting shell casing. When the film was developed that night, the image looked peaceful, too peaceful for what it represented. The machine had become a monument to itself. Soldiers stopped taking trophies. There was nothing left to fear, and nothing worth keeping. The Tigers had gone from legend to scrap metal in less than 2 years. In the final weeks, German units hid the last of them in forests, hoping for one final ambush. None came. The roads filled instead with surrendering columns. Boys in oversized uniforms walking beside beasts that had once made armies tremble. One American lieutenant found a Tiger standing alone at a crossroads, its gun lowered like a bow. He walked up, laid his hand on the armor, and whispered, "It's over, friend." Then he lit a cigarette, turned away, and kept walking. The war had outlasted the monster, and soon, the world would begin asking what lessons it left behind. In the quiet after the war, the world went back to measuring steel. The ruins were still warm, but in laboratories and factories from Detroit to Coventry to Moscow, engineers were already sketching the next generation of tanks, and the ghost of the Tiger watched over every blueprint. At Aberdeen, the captured machines were lined up like exhibits in a museum of fear. American mechanics stripped one of the surviving Tigers down to its bolts. They rebuilt it, tested it, listened to the Maybach engine cough back to life. The sound was different now, not threatening, almost tired. "Feels alive," one of them murmured, resting a hand on the hull. For a moment, they simply listened. The lessons were everywhere. Heavy, sloped armor that could deflect a shell instead of absorbing it. A gun that reached farther than the eye could comfortably see. Optics precise enough to make distance meaningless. The Tiger had not won its war, but it had to find the next one. In Detroit, a young engineer named Lewis Harding studied the reports from Farnborough and Aberdeen. He was designing a new prototype, something faster, lighter, but with a Tiger's bite. He wrote in his notebook, "Borrow its strength, not its weight." Years later, that principle would guide the M46 patent, the first of a line that stretched into the Cold War. Across the Atlantic, the British were doing the same. The Centurion, their new pride, carried a gun that owed its ancestry to the 88mm that had once terrified them. Its armor was angled, its suspension forgiving, its speed deliberate. When test pilots took it across Salisbury Plain, they joked that it felt like driving a reformed sinner, still dangerous, just wiser. Even in the east, behind the new iron borders, the Tiger's shadow reached. Soviet engineers who had captured and dissected the big German cats built their own successors, the T-54, with thick skin and a low, purposeful stance. The shape was different, but the idea was familiar: survive first, kill second. Every tank that rolled out of a post-war factory carried some echo of the Tiger's roar. The Allies never forgot the paradox. They had defeated the machine not by matching its perfection, but by overwhelming it with pragmatism, numbers, fuel, repair crews, logistics. Still, there was grudging respect. He was our enemy, an American officer said during a post-war lecture, pointing at the photo of a tiger. But he was built by genius. The old survivors that hadn't been melted down became relics and teachers. One tiger was shipped to Bovington Camp in England, where it still sits today, its armor scarred, its body restored to motion. When they first ran the engine again in 1951, veterans stood in the crowd, hands in their pockets, faces unreadable. The air filled with that deep, throaty growl, the same sound that once haunted them. But now, instead of fear, there was something like reverence. The crowd clapped quietly. One man whispered, "It's only steel now." In the years that followed, engineers spoke of the tiger not as a monster, but as a mirror. It had shown the limits of obsession, how a weapon could be perfect and still doomed, powerful but unsustainable. A masterpiece designed for victory in theory, not survival in practice. The Americans learned scale, the Soviets learned simplicity, the British learned balance. A German engineer who had once worked on the original project was interviewed in 1950. He said nothing of pride or regret, only a single sentence. "We built a cathedral for a war that needed barns." Decades later, visitors still come to the museums where the last tigers rest. Children climb on their tracks, veterans stand back and stare. The metal no longer smells of oil or death, it smells of time. The paint is new, but the weight remains, a reminder of what brilliance costs when it serves destruction. The tiger did not win its war. It could never have, but it changed every war that came after. A tank is not just a weapon, it's an argument made in steel. And in 1943, Germany's argument was beauty, precision, invincibility. The world answered with endurance, speed, and adaptation. In the end, it wasn't the perfect machine that survived. It was the imperfect men who learned from it. The last tiger runs sometimes, on quiet mornings, for demonstrations. The crowd gathers. The air fills with that old, low thunder. It rolls forward a few meters, then stops. The engine idles, sighs, and dies. And as the echo fades, a truth remains, one written not in glory, but in understanding. Those who build perfection for war are doomed to be buried by it. Because war does not reward the beautiful. It only remembers who endured.